a great pleasure to be back again. Many of the same faces, many new faces as well. Yesterday I talked a little bit about my own sort of historical research on innovation, and particular innovation in the foreign-owned sector, in foreign subsidiaries, which obviously has enormous relevance in Ireland. My talk today is very much my new research and my new book, which is going to be coming out on this subject next year. And it's about innovation in management. That might sound like an odd thing to say, it may be obvious, I'm not quite sure how you view this, but my intention is to get you thinking creatively and perhaps in ways you hadn't before about the way that we can innovate the basic practice of management. That's the objective. And I'm going to, at one point, I'm actually going to get you to do a little exercise here. Let me just forewarn you that you can't just sit and listen for the next hour. So I'm just going to... Okay, not sure this is working. Do you want to see if you can... Talk in three parts. I want to talk about why there's a problem worth solving. Before you start arguing that we need new management models, we better figure out that there's something wrong with the current one, so I want to make that case. Then I'll talk about some of my own research on management innovation, on some of the historical cases. I touched on this briefly yesterday. And then the third part, I'm going to give you some views on how we might do something about this. At a very, very practical level for those business people in the audience. I'm really speaking first and foremost to you about this. We've been through a tumultuous period, and I think, of course, it's not over yet. A few of the kind of culprits, Enron is obviously a few years back, but is still very much a culprit in terms of an organisation that single-handedly destroyed enormous amounts of value. Focus briefly on Lehman Brothers as the most visible evidence that the investment banking community fell apart. Where did Lehman Brothers go wrong? Well, obviously there was a failure of regulation, there was a failure in terms of our market systems, there was a failure in terms of government policy, but for me it was a failure of management. It was a failure on the part of the chief executive and the teams of Lehman and UBS and Citi and all those banks in terms of actually figuring out what they should be doing. Three elements. One, shockingly poor risk management decisions. Some of you will know that there's two different types of errors. There are errors of commission and there are errors of omission. I mean, not only did these banks fail to get into exciting new business areas that very often the hedge funds and the private equity outfits took from them, they also actually made the alternative error, which was actually making very bad decisions within areas that they did choose to invest in. So they failed to invest over here, and they made too many investments over there. And when a company makes both types of errors simultaneously, you know there's something fundamentally wrong with their risk management processes. The incentive systems were perverse. What do I mean by that? That means they did not actually reward the behaviours that the banks really cared about. So I think many of you will know this, but that they were focusing on incentives, compensation, bonuses, all around gross revenues. I mean, to simplify somewhat. Good friends in the banks whose sole objective was to bring in new business at whatever margin it was possible. It didn't matter what the margin was, as long as it increased the gross revenues of the bank as they moved into these areas, mortgage-backed securities and so forth. They had this philosophy of eating what you kill. I think you know that expression. Basically, a philosophy that says if I'm the guy who's leading a particular field, I'm going to make as much money out of that for myself as I can, and of course that completely suppresses the cooperation and teamwork that we want in an organisation. And finally, and this is perhaps overstating it, but the firm, what is the raison d'etre of a Lehman Brothers or a Citibank? Well, it turns out that these were basically shell organisations in which individuals were free to perpetuate what we call the raw vices of capitalism. There's nothing wrong with having individuals trying to make money, as long as they take the risks as well as they take the benefits. Well, of course, what happened in the banks is that they were getting a one-way bet. They shared in the profits, but they really didn't share in the downside. So we know that investment banks got into deep trouble, and for me, as I say, it was all about management failure. It's interesting, just as you look at the General Motors failure, which is working its way through, it was a failure management of a completely different sort. And I won't give you the full story here, but it turns out that many of our basic sort of theories of management built on Peter Drucker's book, The Concept of the Corporation, which was itself kind of a reflection of General Motors' management model back in the 1950s. So a lot of the systems of bureaucracy and standard rules and so forth, all of those theories are built on, in part, the model that General Motors perfected in the 30s. Ross Perot, who famously stood for president, I mean, he was the founder of a company that GM bought, and this is a quote from him: the stress is on not getting results, but on bureaucracy, on conforming to the GM system. So if you think about my point about investment banking and Lehman Brothers as being a kind of a market system run riot within a shell of an organization, GM had the exact opposite problem, which had become too bureaucratic, too hierarchical, and as a result it could no longer see the markets and the customers that they were meant to be serving. So, there's deep down here we've got this basic dichotomy, if you like, between the market system, the things that happen in a marketplace, the free agents choosing to invest in new ideas, to innovate, to take the earnings if they're successful in doing so, versus the firm on the other side. And frankly, when I say a management needs reinventing, what I mean is we need to figure out what the nature of the stuff in that right-hand box is and not confuse it with the stuff in the left. And I think Lehman Brothers did get it. I think they did try to bring the marketplace inside the company rather more aggressively than they should have done. So we can't go much further without defining what we mean by management. Let me just give you, this is straight from Wikipedia. Perhaps you don't trust Wikipedia. I checked a couple of other dictionaries as well. But couple of definitions: getting work done through others, bringing people together to accomplish desired goals. Now these are very, very basic definitions. These would apply to working in a primary school. This would apply to working in an aid organisation. This would apply to working in some sort of community activity. There's nothing in here about hierarchy. Let me just be very clear on this. A lot of people, when you ask them what is management, they immediately gravitate towards managing in a big industrial company. My point is, no, let's not assume that that's what management is. Let's go back to the basic definition of what management's about. This is the definition. And of course the trouble is that the term has been corrupted. The term has been corrupted through two enormously important trends. One is, in fact, the very success of these big industrial companies, the GMs, the GEs, the GSKs. I mean, over 100 years, big industrial companies have come to dominate the landscape. And as a result, most of our theories have been built around what makes those companies successful. And as we know, they're hierarchical, they're bureaucratic, they're goal-directed. A lot of the things that we kind of come to associate with management, and a lot of the things that we've come to associate with bad management, are actually essentially manifestations of a particular form of management that worked in industrial companies. And the hegemony of these companies was not in some ways predestined. That is to say, if you go back through 100 years and you look at the history of this stuff, and the period in the 1890s and 1900s when these companies first came to light, it turned out that there were other equally viable forms of cooperative and collaborative activity going on. The putting out system whereby companies would work in collaboration with each other rather than through these enormously kind of deep vertical silos. So my point is that management as a word, as a broad word, became narrowed and narrowed and narrowed, so that eventually a lot of people started to think of management as management in a big industrial company, which is one species of management, but it is not the genus. And then the other sort of body blow to management as a term came from the rhetoric of leadership. Be very clear what I mean by that. Here's a couple of very famous gurus. Those of you who study management will know these are the biggest names out there: John Fisher, Warren Bennett. Look at their words here. I'm not going to read all of them. The manager kind of copes with complexity, whereas the leader, of course, copes with change. The manager is a good soldier, accepts the status quo, he does things right. The leader is the savior, right? The leader is the guy who takes us out of the kind of mediocrity of the status quo over here and turns our organization on its head. Needless to say, I find this characterization completely inappropriate and unnecessary. In order to build up leadership as an art, as a profession, if you like, they had to kind of put management into a little box. They had to take away things which quite honestly were the work of management and squeeze it down so that it was left to its bare minimum in order to make leadership seem more important. And I think this is really, really bad, really, really misleading. What is a leader? A leader is somebody, leadership is the traits or the characteristics of an individual that makes them worthy of being followed, right? It's about personality, a style. It's about who they are, and it makes them worthy of being followed. That's all very well, but it completely kind of sets aside a lot of the hard work that actually happens on a day-to-day basis in organisations. So I'll just give you, the very, well, relatively recent inauguration of Barack Obama as President of the US. In order to become President of the United States, Obama had to prove himself to be a leader. He had to have charisma, he had to have a vision, people had to want to follow him, otherwise, frankly, he wouldn't have got elected. Now, he had to actually be quite well managed in his campaign, and he did some very innovative things in his campaign. But to get elected, it was an 80% leadership job. Is he going to be a success in the White House? Well, I would say that his ability to succeed in the White House will come down not to his leadership, but to his management skills. His ability to get things done. So yes, his leadership skills are important. And they got him there, and they will continue to be important because people will continue to look to him. But unless he's also a good manager, he has failed in his task. So you see what I'm saying? I mean, we mustn't make this artificial distinction. Good, effective executives are managers, and they are leaders. I would say one of the reasons why investment banking got into trouble is they were overled and undermanaged. That is to say that they actually had too many leaders with grand views of where they were trying to go without necessarily the skills to actually get them there. So I think there is a real problem here, and the problem stems from a misunderstanding of what management is. And one of my big objectives over the next couple of years is to try to take management as a term and actually reinvigorate it, kind of remind everybody that we need successful management, and management can actually be the make or break of your organizations. A couple more points about management. Here's a completely different angle on the same problem. You can't read at the bottom. Richard Layard is an economist at London School of Economics, and he studies happiness. You thought economists studied economies, but no. They now study pretty much anything under the sun. And they're interested in what makes people happy. So Richard Layard did a survey, and he surveyed thousands and thousands of people about this, among other things, this question: who are you happiest with? Who are you happiest spending time with? Any thoughts on which of the following will be the people we're happiest with? Well, it turns out I put them in order. We're happiest with our friends, it turns out. We love our spouses and our kids, but we fight with them as well. So perhaps that's why they end up on average. But clearly, what I want to do is draw your attention to the bottom of this. I think you can see where I'm going with this. On average, people prefer to spend their time alone, to nobody, than with their boss. Now, why is this? In theory, the boss is the individual or individuals with whom we have the most productive, value-added relationship. We spend 8 or 10 hours a day at work with our boss, and yet most of us are saying that actually the boss, on average, destroys more value than he or she adds. I'm going to talk about a chap later called Henry Stewart, who's the chief executive of a small IT training company in London called... Did I do that? There you go. All for effect, of course. Henry Stewart, he says, when you get a call saying the boss wants to see you at 3 p.m. this afternoon, does that fill you with excitement? Or does it, leave that sort of nagging pit in your stomach? And of course, if you've ever read the Financial Times and read Lucy Kellaway's column, if you've ever watched The Office, the sitcom, if you've ever read Dilbert, you've done some of the above. These are all mechanisms for essentially parodying managers. The premise of all of these is to simply say managers are dullards. They're stupid. They don't understand what they're doing. They're far less on the pulse of what's happening in the organisation. The individuals sort of on the front lines. So there's a problem. That's the simple point I'm trying to make here. I don't know quite how far this might change, but I cannot believe this is as good as it gets in terms of the quality of management that happens in most organisations. And as you see, this happens in 20-person organisations, and this happens in 200,000-person organisations. So as I say, I'm on a bit of a quest to reinvent management, and we have to start our reinvention process by actually redefining the word and making sure that we make the effective separation between what is leadership and what is management, and making it clear that we do both. And we need to, I think, broaden our horizons about what the nature of good quality management is. You know, there's a very famous lady called Mary Parker Follett. If any of you have ever studied management, you've heard of her. She was alive in the 1890s, and she was writing about management, and a lot of her theories of management, as we kind of dust off those old books today, are incredibly wrong. They're all about authority is earned, not given. All about this idea that we have some sort of collective responsibility. A lot of kind of contemporary thoughts about management actually come from Mary Parker Follett's writings over 100 years ago. Was she studying General Motors and industrial oil? No, she wasn't. She was studying community organizations in Boston at the turn of the last century. So her theories of management were built on completely different sort of benchmarks and examples. She was studying communities where people choose to volunteer to work, where people do not have executive authority. So my point is that we can broaden our views as to the nature of management. And one of the big points I want to make over the course of this hour is that there are principles of management out there which are fundamentally different to the ones that we've historically focused on. And, you know, flip side of that really is that we need to be innovative about the work we do. We mustn't assume that the way that we do our budgeting processes or our capital allocation or our performance development, procedures, there's no reason to assume that this is the best way that we might be organized. There are reasons why we have these systems. I believe we can significantly challenge a lot of the very sort of day-to-day practices of management. So, that's my first point. My first sort of part of this talk is to say management is not working as well as it might. Management has failed us over the last few years, but in fact that's just the tip of the iceberg. A lot of the work of management, quite honestly, is a long way from being as good as it might be. Which brings to part two, which is about this, my own research on the subject of management innovation. And what I've done is I've just pulled up some of the big innovations of the last century. I'm not going to talk about these. I mean, these are all words that you recognize. Some of them have had an enormous impact. Yesterday, for example, I talked about the assembly line of Ford. I talked about Toyota and total quality management. These words and these sort of the movements that underlie those things, these have moved the world of management forward. That is to say, the way that we manage today is not exactly the same as it was 100 years ago. But in fact, in some ways it is remarkably similar. A lot of the real kind of landmark innovations actually occurred in a period roughly from kind of 1900 through to 1930. A lot of the basic ways of working, and I'm talking about management processes here. The management process, the way by which we get work done, a lot of those processes actually took shape in the 1900-1930 period, and since then, a lot of them have been kind of incrementally improved, but not radically transformed. Not all of them. The whole open innovation movement that we talked about yesterday, for me that is a genuine innovation in the way that we do work in collaboration with others. But a lot of the stuff that happens inside companies has been improving incrementally. I showed this slide yesterday. This is the only slide I'm going to show today and yesterday. It was trying to make the point that management innovation can be put in a kind of a stack of different types of innovation. And then arguably it's at the top of the stack, by which I mean a company that is able to significantly change its fundamental philosophy about management, and the way that they do that is potentially going to get advantage out of that. So you take a well-known example, the software industry. Microsoft perfected the kind of the big software project, Microsoft Vista. I forget the numbers of people involved in creating Microsoft Vista, but it was into the thousands of people, all collaborating through, shall we say, the Microsoft hierarchy with Bill Gates, the chief software architect. That is a management model. The assumption that we need a hierarchical team of people to come up with the next groundbreaking software. Well, as any of you know who have downloaded Linux or Mozilla Firefox or whatever, you will know that there are equally valid alternative management models out there for creating software code. And if the Linux movement yes, there is some hierarchical relationships between the developers in terms of who can tell who what to do. But the point is, this is a bunch of individuals who are choosing to collaborate together to create software. And of course, the point is that Bill Gates and Microsoft cannot compete head-on with what Linux is doing. Because everything that they've done, the whole edifice that they've created there, is premised on the idea that they will control the software programs, rather than software programmers choosing to come together of their own volition. Now, one is a for-profit and one is a not-for-profit. So, the point is that Microsoft cannot change its format to the other one. And that's why I'm putting it at the top of the tree. A lot of the lower level forms of innovation, operational product innovation, once a company has figured out what their competitors are doing, it's copyable. You can fairly quickly re-engineer what a competitor is doing. The trouble with management innovation is it's so systemic, it gets so much at the heart of the basic principles and choices you've made that you cannot quickly transform from A to B. So for me, management innovation has the potential for making a real difference, but interestingly, there's virtually no research on it. This is more to the researchers in the room than the business people. But when you look at the number of papers using certain keywords, technology innovation, 50,000, these are thousands. Management innovation of the order of 70 or 80 articles. So, we don't want to overinterpret this, but management innovation, strategic innovation have been completely dwarfed as topics for research by the academic fraternities. So there's a bit of a disconnect between the importance of management innovation and the actual research that's done on it. And part of the reason for that is it's so difficult to do, for reasons I'll get into. And part of it might also be the words that we're using, which I'll also come back to. So a quick sort of detour into how management innovation takes place. I've written an academic paper on this subject, trying to make sense of essentially the process whereby an organisation sees an opportunity for changing its management model, for experimenting with a new one, for implementing that the earlier, and then validating and labelling it. The labelling is important. We'll come back to that in a second. Best done through an example. You've all come across the balanced scorecard. Many of your organisations use the balanced scorecard or some derivative thereof. It turns out that this was not the invention of Professor Robert Kaplan at Harvard Business School. It was the invention of a guy called Art Schneiderman, who was a kind of mid to senior executive at Analog Devices, some 15 odd years ago, 18 years ago. And Art Schneiderman, he was a planning guy, and his job was to prepare the plans for the chief executive at the bi-weekly meetings. And of course, the trouble was he had a chief executive who was a kind of a big picture guy, and he had a chief operating officer, also he was reporting to, who was the numbers guy. And they would get into these fights. Do we want to put the numbers up first and then get into the qualitative stuff? Do we want to have the big picture qualitative stuff and then dig into the numbers? And eventually, this is a blinding flash of the obvious in some ways, but he said to himself, aha, what if we actually combined the qualitative and the quantitative indicators of success, and we will present them in a single balanced scorecard? He didn't use the word balanced scorecard at that point in time, but the corporate scorecard he called it. And the point is that he tried this out. He came up with this, as I say, blinding flash of the obvious. He put it in place in Analog Devices. And it would have stayed there just as another little incremental innovation if it wasn't for the fact he then got to know this chap Kaplan at Harvard. And Harvard and Kaplan has got a good eye for these things. He was also the father of activity-based costing. And Kaplan said, aha, there's a nice principle here. Now it turns out this principle is as old as the hills. The French had this thing called the tableau de bord a few hundred years back, which was more or less the same concept. But essentially, Kaplan said, we can label this, we can validate it, we can show how it affects the big picture. We can write a Harvard Business Review article about it, we can write a book about it, and we can essentially take it to the world, and that's what he's done. And the fact that you all know about the balanced scorecard, and many of your organizations use the balanced scorecard, is essentially a combination of Robert Kaplan, the professor, but also the original idea coming from Schneiderman. So my point is the following. Where do management innovations come from? They very, very rarely come from academics. We are good at kind of codifying and documenting good practice. We're good at picking up on things which are already happening, but we're not very good at inventing stuff. The inventions, the new management practices, come from It's what? From the world of practice, from the Schneidermans of this world who say, we don't have a suitable reporting system here, we need to create a better one. So invention happens sort of on the coalface, in the organization, but the process of turning those things into something that others can use, and in terms of how the sort of knowledge moves on, that is actually a process whereby the academics and the consultants and the media have quite an important role to play. So one often thinks in terms of, shall we say, academically oriented practitioners and practice-oriented academics kind of getting together. And these sort of conferences, quite honestly, are the sort of places where that sort of meeting of minds happens. So, as I've been studying management innovation, balanced scorecard, quality management, all of these long list of innovations, a couple of important summary observations that have come to mind. One is that innovation can happen at two levels. It can happen just purely in the words, the rhetoric of management. Now you might say that's got nothing to do with management, but in fact, effective rhetoric can enable action. I mean, rhetoric's not a bad thing in and of itself. But for me, management innovation has to be effective, has to both affect the way of working, the actual practice of management, the day-to-day work we do, and it also has to be appropriately labelled to ensure that it then endures, because otherwise the risk of it disappears. These are so sort of endemic to the way that big organisations and indeed small organisations work today, that most of us have no way of getting out of that box. And as I said, one of my objectives is to help us sort of squeeze our way out of that box, because there are alternative ways. And the most radical, this is an interesting point here, the most radical management ideas actually very rarely get diffused. Some of you might have read a book about a Brazilian company called Semco. There's a famous book, it's called Maverick. Ricardo Semler is the author. And this is a company, it's a wacky company. I mean, they do things like allow their employees to set their own salaries, which is an interesting approach. I mean, that's just the most sort of eye-grabbing one. But they've done a whole range of completely unusual, unorthodox approaches to management. And they get hundreds and hundreds of visitors from America, from Europe, come in to sort of see how they do it. And they all go away scratching their heads saying, I'll never work in my company. Of course, that's the point, is it will not work, because what they're trying to pull out specific practices rather than to getting to the underlying kind of principles on which this particular company is based. So there are always a few oddities. There's a company called Oticon in Denmark. There's a company called Semco in Brazil. I'm going to mention a couple of them shortly. There's a company called W.L. Gore in the US. These are companies which were founded on very different management principles. And because their principles of management were so unique and they built on that foundation, what they do works. But if you try to pull that out and plonk it down somebody else, it would rarely work. So one must be a little bit cautious before saying management innovation means new ways of working which everybody can adopt. The reality is that a lot of more radical ideas struggle to get diffused. So that's my part two. Just a quick sort of summary of my research on management innovation. And as I say, a little bit more sceptical about the concept than perhaps you might have expected. So the part three, and this is the mainstay of the presentation, is about what the future of management really looks like. Now here's a bunch of words. You recognise these. It's customary in these sort of presentations to say that the future looks decentralised and empowered and virtual. Yes, but it turns out, there's a famous book, Beyond the Hype, by a couple of Harvard profs, Nitin Urea and Bob Eccles, and they wrote a book 20 years ago, which basically said, here are these words, everybody tells us that organisations of the future will look like that. But in fact, the closer we look, the more we realise that people have been saying this for decades. The same ideas about empowerment, often with slightly different labelling, come back time and time again. The human relations movement, the sort of participation, work, democracy, empowerment, engagement, lots of different words describing the same sort of things. And every kind of generation kind of reinvents these ideas that we might have flat, empowered, decentralized organizations. So, their conclusion was that in fact, whilst there's nothing new under the sun, it's actually useful to engage with these concepts. and to actually as a mechanism for enabling action. My conclusion is a little bit different. It is to say, first of all, we need to figure out why it is that despite decades of talk about empowerment and decentralization, why, in fact, our organizations continue to be relatively hierarchical. And to offer kind of a way forward which doesn't assume that companies will always be traditionally managed, and neither does it assume that they'll all be completely different along the way. Okay, so I'm trying to find a way through this little puzzle. Three hypotheses as to why the amount of real management innovation over the last half century has been less than we might expect. First of all, a lot of what we do is necessary. Do we need some level of hierarchy in our organizations? Yes. Let's not have a false debate. I'm never going to advocate that we should be moving to completely anti-hierarchical or flat organizations. You go and look at tribes of monkeys. You look at the way that the Linux open source software movement is organized. You look at settings in completely different non-business contexts, and what you see is hierarchy emerging. There's some level of hierarchical organization is valuable. So let's not have a false debate about that. This is a more tricky point. The argument that, in fact, the way that we're doing things now is not as good as it gets, but neither is it completely broken. And what we've done is we've kind of incrementally improved the way that we work, and we've created a model of organization which, for the most part, is effective, but is not as effective as it might be. You take a case like, I wrote a case study on Rolls-Royce in the UK's high-performance work teams. And you know what a high-performance work team is? A high-performance work team is a group who are kind of self-managing. They take responsibility for a set of tasks, and they figure out for themselves who's going to do what. They train themselves up in multiple different tasks. And the theory says that if you build a high-performance work team, a team which is multitasking and managing itself, they will enjoy their work more, they will deliver a higher quality product, and ultimately they'll be more productive. What Rolls found is essentially that this model worked but was incredibly fragile, if you see what I mean. That is to say, there were so many kind of preconditions that had to be in place in order for this group to do its job effectively. And as soon as a crisis hit, or as soon as there was a bit of a management labour problem, and as soon as there was a quality issue, everything kind of collapsed back down to the more traditional way of working. So it's not that you can't build different ways of working, it's just that it's quite difficult to do. And those of us who are in positions of power, of course, we wouldn't quite put it in these words, but it took us 20 years to get to the top of organisations. It's quite difficult, and the same with politicians, by the way. It's very difficult to envision ourselves, as it were, knocking that down and giving that power back to our people. No, it happens from time to time. I'm not saying it can't happen, but our natural kind of predisposition is towards, enjoying the comfort of the position that we've got ourselves into. And then the third point, and this is important, is that up to now we've lacked the right mechanisms or technologies or whatever to enable us to change the way that we work. And what I'm going to talk around over the next half an hour is what is often called Web 2.0 technologies. You know what I mean by Web 2.0. I mean Wikipedia, I mean Facebook, I mean the various interactive tools that are available nowadays in the internet, whereby it's not a one-way transmission of information. I am personally contributing to this sort of organic entity that I get the more people that contribute to it, the more value we get out of it. This is what's called Web 2.0, and for me, Web 2.0, the technologies behind that are also now opening up possibilities of new ways of collaborating that will work their way through into the way that organizations structure and conduct themselves. Interestingly, there's also the so-called Generation Y employees, the ones who are born 1980 or earlier, who are just entering the workplace. There's a potential argument, not as strong, but a potential argument that the Generation Y employees are also forcing us to revisit a lot of our traditional principles, because they come to work, of course, with a set of expectations which are rather different to those of the Generation X or the baby boomers. So, here's my way forward. My way forward is to say that we need to think carefully about what we mean by management model as a vehicle for surfacing our assumptions about the way we work. And I want to just compare it to business model. You all know what I mean by a business model. You didn't know 10 years ago with the dot-com era. You remember the sort of the dot-com boom, 1999, 2000. What happened there, of course, was a lot of companies emerged with fundamentally different approaches to managing their revenues and their costs. And we started talking about business models as a way of helping to get our heads around the fact that a company like an Amazon.com can compete with a W.H. Smith or a Barnes & Noble, compete head-to-head with the same customers with a completely different set of assumptions about the way that their cost and revenue structure will work, and how the Ryanairs and the EasyJets were able to take on the British Airways of this world. The business model is essentially the set of choices we make about how we make money. How do we make money in this industry? We make choices about our sources of revenues, how our costs will work, what will we make, what will we buy, a few other things. This is a business model. And in any given industry, we can see coexisting a number of different business models. Airlines is the classic one. We try to create these some companies try to create these business class only transatlantic airlines. That was a new business model. It turned out not to work for various reasons. But we see 3 or 4 different business models coexisting in the same industry, and you can say the same in the world of business schools, and you can say the same in the world of automobiles and so forth. If that's the most important question that you have to ask as a business leader, what is our business model? What is the theory of our business? For me, the second most important question you have to answer is how do we do this? This is about the what and the who and the what and the why. The management model is how are we going to deliver on our chosen business model? And I'm now going to boil down management into 4 things. Management model is the choice we make about how we define objectives, how we motivate effort, how we coordinate activities, and how we allocate resources. I'm saying that the work of management can be defined in terms of those 4 sets of things. Now, does that cover every possible element of management? Probably not. I deliberately not put controlling in there. For me, controlling is controlling is the avoidance of a negative rather than the creation of a positive, if you see what I mean. For me, management, let's focus on the value-adding activities of management. And let's see controlling as kind of the way that we ensure that those 4 things get done effectively. So that's why I didn't put controlling into that box. You might have your own favourite aspects of the world of management that I haven't considered there. I'm not trying to say it's universal. I'm trying to say it covers most of what we do in management. So a very simple framework, and for the next half an hour or so, I'm just going to step you through the elements of that with some examples and a little bit of an exercise at one point. I like to separate them out into 2 pairs, ends and means. Our ends are, what are the ends? We're trying to manage our objectives. Where is this organisation going? We're trying to manage individual motivation in terms of the ends for an individual. What matters to an individual? Why do they choose to come to work? And the means of delivering those ends are the activities that we do and how we manage, so we say, across, how we coordinate our activities. And then, if you like, managing down the decisions that we make, the way that we communicate information up and down the organisation. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a kind of a traditional principle on the left, and I'm going to give you an alternative principle on the right. Scratching my head saying, what's obliquity? I'll tell you what obliquity is in a second. The point is that for each of these activities, there are some classic kind of traditional ways of looking forward, and there are some alternative ways of looking forward. And let me just reiterate one more time. I'm not saying everything is going towards the right. I'm not saying left, bad, right, good. I'm saying if we can dimensionalize the activities of management, we can make much more thoughtful decisions about where we want to lie on a particular spectrum. There's no right or wrong. Some organisations are actually appropriately managed in a more traditional hierarchical way. Others need to be a little bit more radical. So let me take you through alignment versus obliquity, and then I'll do the same for the other 3 categories. Alignment. I picked up a book called Alignment. I thought I need to sort of research what we mean by alignment, and fortunately Robert Kaplan, the Harvard Prof I mentioned earlier, has written a book called Alignment. And in the very opening pages, he uses the analogy of an 8-man rowing team. And of course, it's a beautiful analogy at one level because these people are perfectly aligned. They are all working harmoniously towards a very, very clear, simple objective. The trouble is that our organisations are nothing like 8-man rowing teams, because the way that we construct our organisations by design is that we put people into those organisations who have different skills, who have different, shall we say, narrow objectives. The scientists working in an R&D lab, are they fully aligned in terms of what they're trying to do with the accountants who are running that company? You can argue that they should be aligned in terms of some sort of higher level goal, but in fact, in terms of what turns them on, what keeps them working in that organisation, they actually have very, very different goals. So I want to say that alignment has its place, and there are organisations which need to be fully aligned and can be fully aligned. But I want to just, have a little go. And this is the most radical or the most difficult of the four, by the way. It just so happens it comes first because it's the overall objectives. I want to have a go at suggesting that there are different ways of working which are not all about direct alignment. And I'm going to come up with this concept of obliquity, an oblique path to success. I'll just give you a couple of examples before I define this out. Vinit Nayar is the president of HCL Technologies, and it's an IT services company. It's one of the big IT services companies. Competes with EDS and IBM and Accenture and all those guys. And this is kind of the number 9 player in that industry. And he said to himself, look, if we're going to be a success, we've got to do something a little bit different. And for him, value is added in the relationship between the employees and the customers. So my job, he says, is to spoil my employees, is to make sure that my employees feel that this is a really cool place to work. So he made a point of going to his big customer forum, and he announced to the customer forum, our strategy from now on is employees first, customers second. Okay, now, the share price took a bit of a hit the next day. Because customers don't want to hear that. But he said, look, trust me, basically. He says, we are building an organisation whereby my job is to make sure my employees are really, really motivated. And their job, of course, is then to make their customers happy. So this is an oblique, so he's not jumping straight to customer satisfaction. He's saying, in order to get to customer satisfaction, I want to go a slightly different route. I want to make sure that I am single-handedly devoting myself to making my employees happy. And he's built a whole bunch of management practices to support that. So one of his management practices, some of you may have read about this, he's encouraged all of his managers to post their 360-degree feedback results online for anyone to see. Obviously, individuals' comments are not attributed, but he showed me his 360-degree feedback about how he works, and he encouraged all of his other managers to do so. And gradually, bit by bit, they did so. And what happens, of course, is that if you're a good manager, you're happy to do this. You're keen to have the world know that you're doing a good job. If you're not doing so well, you've got a couple of choices. You can either leave the company and go somewhere else, or you can actually work on your weaknesses. So there's a whole raft of things he's done, but the neatest sort of little trick he's played is to say, if I want management to be taken seriously, if I want employees to realise that their managers are trying to help them, we need to create some transparency in the quality of our management. And this is one way of doing it. So, obliquity. Another couple of pieces of evidence. Here's 2 very different mission statements. ExxonMobil is about achieving superior financial and operating results while simultaneously adhering to high ethical standards. Very clear what comes first, superior financial results. What's IKEA's view of the world? To create a better everyday life for the many. No mention of products, no mention of money. That is an oblique goal in my worldview. Now you might call it a mission statement, that's fine. But the point is that IKEA is saying if we aim for this higher order goal, we will have motivated people and ultimately we will be successful. And indeed, I think you'll know, IKEA is a phenomenally successful company. It's a private company, so we don't know just how wealthy Ingvar Kamprad and his sons are. But it is up there. And just one more piece of evidence. Some of you will have read Built to Last. This is Jim Collins and Jerry Parras' book. Built to Last was a book about visionary companies. There's a list of visionary companies. Companies that were defined in terms of how successful essentially they've been over the long term. And all these companies, it turns out, had these higher order mission statements. In the case of Disney, it was all about having fun. In the case of Merck, it was all about ridding the world of diseases and so forth. Alongside this list of visionary companies, they also created a kind of a comparison list of companies that had done okay, but were not quite in the same leagues. And what they discovered is the following. They discovered that these companies, despite the fact that they didn't talk about money, were actually more profitable on average than the benchmark companies who had much clearer financial goals. So think about that for a second. The companies who didn't apparently ostensibly care about money were actually more profitable than the ones that very directly cared about money. And what's going on there? You know, go back to your own view of the world, your own personal life. If you want to be happy and you want to be happy, you know, tomorrow, you know, you might go for a long walk in the countryside, you might take your kids to the movies, I don't know, what, you know, whatever you choose. If you decided you wanted to be happy on a daily basis for the next year, and did all of those sort of things, the sort of things that you enjoy momentarily, if you spent your whole life doing that stuff, 2 years from now, I guarantee you would kind of realise that in fact you had a rather empty and shallow life, if you see what I mean. You know, studies of happiness have shown that the people who are happy on their deathbed, as it were, the people who are truly contented, are the ones who have actually worked really hard to overcome, you know, some struggle, or have worked, you know, hard in school in order to achieve something. So day-to-day happiness is a very different thing than kind of looking back on your life and being contented with what you've done. So I hope I'm convincing you that at the very least, this concept of obliquity has some merits. I'll just give you 3 more ways of looking at it, and then we'll move on to the next one. I think there's 3 different types of oblique goals. And this is the second place I've ever tried this, if you see what I mean. I tried it out a couple of weeks ago. You're the second audience who even seen it. So if you don't like it, tell me afterwards. I've got it wrong, that's fine. You can pursue indirect goals. This is Vineet Nayar saying, employees first, employees are ready, customers second. We can pursue to some degree orthogonal goals. What do I mean by that? Think about your R&D scientists. What is it that turns on the R&D scientists in your organization if you're a high-tech company? They like the idea that they can pursue knowledge, they can pursue cutting-edge ideas. Do they care if those ideas are ultimately commercial? Well, at one level they do, otherwise they might just work for a university. But the fact is, if you told them exactly what to do and it was all application and development specific, rather than allowing them to pursue things that they got excited about, my guess is a lot of them do. So for me, the second model is, these are the research scientists. We encourage them to do interesting stuff. And then we, the managers, essentially choose which of those things we want to take on and actually make commercial entities of. So we're encouraging our people to pursue somewhat orthogonal goals because we know that of the stuff that they produce, some of it will be really valuable in some people. And then the third category, I call it leap of faith. I don't know quite what to call this, but essentially there are companies out there, Whole Foods Market in the US, IKEA will be one, Seventh Generation is another US company in the same category, ethical companies, socially responsive companies that say, I don't really care actually if we don't make a whole lot of money. But what I do care about is, you know, doing good in the world, A. And we think that if we do good in the world, we will actually create, shall we say, an ecosystem of stakeholders who generate value from that. And one of them might be financial, and one of them might be our customers, and one of them might be our employees. So in the first two, the means and the ends are known, as it were. We know where we're trying to get to. In the third one, there's almost a sense of we don't have a strong view on who our ultimate stakeholder is. We believe all stakeholders have a role to play, and that there is an interdependence there between the parts. And in fact, if we're successful, what we do is we kind of grow the pie for everybody rather than cut the pie one particular. Okay, enough on alignment and obliquity. I've got 3 more to cover in 15 minutes, so let me crack on. Individual motivation. This is the oldest story of the four. You're all familiar, I suspect, with the concept of extrinsic versus intrinsic motivation. Extrinsic means material rewards given to you from outside. Intrinsic means it kind of comes from within. The old terminology here was theory X and theory Y. Douglas McGregor in the 50s made this comparison. And my point here is that many organisations can focus on their extrinsic goals, on paying people well. More likely to be long-lasting success is the one that actually build on some sort of intrinsic motivation. And of course, the best companies probably do a bit of the two. There is a real problem to be solved here, and it's about what we might call employee engagement. Studies have been done, this is by Towers Perrin, of the level of employee engagement in companies. Lots of different ways of measuring this. The headline statistic is the percentage of people who are highly engaged. Look at that blue line. You know, in the UK, it's kind of 15%. In the US, it's 21%. The percentage of people across the workforce who are highly engaged in their work is, you know, a fifth of the total. And this is a scandalous figure if you think about it. You know, what if we could get that number from, in the US case, from 21 to 31%? An additional, you know, 10% of people choosing to give kind of their all. What does engagement look like? This is where the audience participation comes in. I'm going to ask you to think about this question. This is to ensure that you stay with it. I want you to quickly, very, very quickly, in 60 seconds maximum, talk to your neighbour about this question. The last time you did a piece of work where you were fully engaged and motivated, you were excited by the work you were doing, you enjoyed it, you worked long hours, what were the key features of that project? Speak to your neighbour then. 45 seconds. And if you haven't got a neighbour, talk to yourself. This is not meant to be a scientific activity, this is purely to get you thinking a little bit more. But we don't have a flip chart, but I'm going to just let's just shout out a few answers and I'll kind of make a mental note. Who wants to tell me what you got? Someone. Anybody? Ownership. Don't be shy. Ownership. Ownership of a project. This is my project. Nobody else is going to take it away from me. What else? A unique problem. This is something that nobody's actually kind of cracked before. This is mine. It's related to ownership, but it's also there's satisfaction in solving a problem. Right? I think that's what you're getting at. Yeah. What else? Urgency. Urgency. Right. There's a time limit, and as we know, that's one of the things that gets the juices flowing. Yeah?
A state of flow.
A state of flow. This is the unpronounceable sixth sense Mihaly, right? Yeah. Some of you will know what I'm talking about. There's a very famous academic who has an unpronounceable name, and he calls this the state of flow, where you're so kind of wrapped up in your work that you kind of lose all sense of time. And some of us have been there. Project, some of us probably haven't. What else?
Tangible result.
Tangible result, right. Not only was it my problem, but out of it came something which I could actually, you know, be credited with as a success. What else?
Passion.
Passion. Yeah. Now, in some way, passion is the outcome of some of the other things. I mean, the point is that it's something which you were prepared to be passionate about. Passion for the... And what were the attributes that made you passionate about it? I guess that's the way I would put it.
You were thinking something similar, where your heart rules your head.
Right. So where it goes from being a rational to, as you say, something in the heart or the gut, somewhere lower down the body, as it were, that's where you kind of come alive. What else?
Team engagement.
Team. So something about working with others, right? Yeah. You know, sometimes if you're forced together with a group of people and you actually achieve something that none of you could achieve on your own, that's enormously satisfying. Yeah. Oh. Right. Okay.
It's something significance to the project, and that it's stimulating.
Right. So this is something that had material results that others could also benefit from. And, you know, whether it's corporate results or, you know, saving the world results, doesn't matter. The point is some significance, yeah.
Yes, good morning. Does indirectly engage help at all?
Indirectly engaged?
Yes, because this is a thing that was on opening gates and forks without having to get down off the tractor.
Okay, I missed that.
Opening the gate.
Yes, opening the gate.
Gate.
Yeah.
Going through a gate.
Yes. Yeah.
Without having to get off the tractor.
Right. Opening the gate, going through the gateway without getting off the tractor.
And then the gate closes when you go through.
The gate tells you when you've gone through.
The gate closes.
The gate closes. Okay. Okay. Struggling to sort of see how this is about. But again, maybe we'll take that one later.
Unachievable goals.
Achievable goals.
Almost.
Almost. This is the kind of the concept of stretch goals, right? You know, if the goals are too low, it's kind of boring. If the goals are too high, you kind of lose interest. But the goals which are just at the right level, absolutely. Look, one more.
Freedom of expression.
Right. The right to say things as you think they are, rather than as somebody else, you think someone else wants you to think they are, or something like that. So, look, this is as I would expect, it's all about having the responsibility to do something significant, sometimes working with others, sometimes working on your own. The point is that we have different things that turn us on. What is the role of management in this? Now, think about the person who might have been supervising you in this particular project. And what role does the manager play in ensuring that all of those things come true?
Provide resources?
Sorry?
Provide
Yeah, I mean, it's a much smaller role. And point number one, right? Managers destroy more value than they add in a lot of places. They're just getting out of the way. We would actually make things a whole lot better quite often. So what do managers provide? They provide the resources. What else do they provide? Sorry?
Encouragement.
They provide encouragement. They provide support. They provide mentorship if there's something which you're struggling with and you need to sound them out for advice.
Focus.
They provide focus. They provide a sense of direction. Right? If I'm kind of pursuing something but I have no idea why I'm doing it or where I'm going with it, that's also a waste of time. I mean, it's very, very easy and very quick to come up with a kind of a view of the role of effective management in providing an overall sense of direction, perhaps providing some formal boundaries, and providing the resources and the support that enable people. But without that, top-down meddling that so many of us actually end up getting involved in. And of course, it's very easy to say in a room like this, and as we know, when the kind of the rubber hits the road and the project's going off its rails, the first inclination as a manager is to kind of grab it and get the person reporting to you on a daily basis. So, and there's good reasons and bad reasons for doing that. My point here in that little exercise is twofold. One is to remind us just how minimal a role good management often is, because people actually love the opportunity to do things themselves. And then secondly, to kind of motivate this little, this is from Gary Hamel, a friend of mine. He makes the following point about engagement. He says, look, anybody in the world, literally in the world, go to India, China, wherever, you can find employees who are obedient, competent, and diligent. Right? We can define an employment contract, if you like, which requires obedience and competence and diligence. But look at those three higher order things. If we want an organisation that is innovative, that is actually trying to make a difference, that is delivering on its potential, we need these three higher order forms of engagement. Initiative, seeing opportunities and acting on them, creativity and passion, we used those words already. The top three here are gifts. That is to say, it's up to the employee whether he or she gives you their initiative, creativity or passion or not. You can contract for the first three, the gifts. And the nature of effective management is about how we essentially encourage people in those we create an environment in which those top three things happen. And that's an important point. Now how we do that, I appreciate, is a big challenge. And I've got a few ideas and examples to help you with that. But if you're interested in understanding motivation of employees, the bottom three can all be motivated through extrinsic mechanisms by paying people. You cannot really pay people to deliver initiative, creativity, and passion. Well, not in a conventional sense. You have to be more creative about how you do it. So, the basic framework is very simple, which is that on the one hand we have doing work for direct material rewards, doing work for its own sake. This is the flow, this is the doing, going and playing the piano just purely for its own enjoyment. In the middle we actually have a sort of a hybrid situation, whereby I do a good job, in large part because I get status and recognition and satisfaction out of that. Because I enjoy being patted on the back and being told, good job. Is that extrinsic or is it intrinsic? It's actually what the academics would call internalized extrinsic, meaning it is extrinsically given. You're given the promotion, you're given the pat on the back, but you internalize the value of that so much that it almost becomes an internal thing. Just briefly, some evidence, if this is interesting. A study from a friend of mine in the US. He looked at R&D workers, and he looked at the importance of a set of factors. And they said these were the following, these were the most important factors, whereby the larger bar is the more important. What's more interesting about this list is which ones actually correlated with were predictors of the number of hours they choose to work. And these are all R&D scientists who are working amazing tonight. So, the measure, if you like, of engagement was how many hours did they choose to work? Well, it turns out that salary, intellectual challenge, and level of responsibility all have a positive effect on the desire to work. And of course, salary is a purely extrinsic measure, and these are much more intrinsic. So my point is a blending of extrinsic and intrinsic mechanisms is actually most powerful. Interestingly, and you can draw your own conclusions here, job security has a negative impact on the likelihood of working long hours. I think you understand what's going on there. More secure job, less hours worked. Okay. A company. I mentioned them briefly yesterday. Top Coder is a US software company. And they do not have their own employees. Sorry, they do not have their own software employees. They have a community, 170,000 people out there. And these are people who will often work, for free for open source software movements. People who they've never met. People who get enormous joy out of basically taking part in doing software. And software coding as a competitive sport. And they have this bright idea that in fact a lot of software guys, they don't really care about the money. What they care about is being known to be really smart kids, mostly kids, who can write the quickest and the cleverest algorithm for solving a problem. So they turned it into a sport. They turned it into a tournament-based activity. So whereby when they have a client who needs some software development, they chunk it out into pieces, and then they put each piece, each module out for bid. They say, we're going to have a little mini tournament, and they might get 10 software coders around the world, all vying for the right to create the perfect piece of software code. And at the end of that tournament, the winner, and these things can be objectively measured in terms of the quality of the code, the winner gets a prize, a significant prize, it might be $5,000, $10,000, and the losers get nothing. And then the results get totted up, and they create these ranking lists of, certain universities come out top of the list. Warsaw University, turns out, is big in the world of top coder, because they've got a lot of very smart computer scientists there. Now, why is that interesting or relevant? This is Tomek, with one of their champion coders. He's gone to do a PhD in America now. But for a number of years, he was one of their champion coders. You've got to kind of get on the skin of what motivates him as an individual. And it turns out he loves programming. He doesn't mind having the possibility of winning a prize, that's nice. But what really, really turns him on is this idea that it's like a big computer game. This is the gaming generation. And it's all about the levels you get to, and it's all about winning the prize. And the status and recognition that is afforded to him. So my point is, here's an organization that doesn't have software employees, that is using a lot of these traditional mechanisms, but it's doing it in a virtual way. And it's using some fairly creative ways of getting people to choose to give their time, because these are not employees, these are people, some of whom don't make a single penny out of it, and yet they've managed to turn it into a successful business model. Okay, so that's about motivation. Let me take the last two and then I will wrap up. Managing across. How do we coordinate activities in an organization? You all know about bureaucracy. Bureaucracy, it turns out, is, look, it's a pejorative term, but of course it wasn't always a pejorative term. Max Weber, the German sociologist, essentially was the guy who coined the word back in the 30s. And for him, bureaucracy was actually the superior form of organising. Because rather than allowing an organisation to be kind of held hostage to the whims of an autocrat, to a family member, it was actually an organisation that ran with rules and formal structures. And for him, this was actually a superior mechanism. What's happened over the years, of course, is that this word has been corrupted as well. And the rules and the structures have come to take over. Emergence or self-organisation is often talked about as the alternative way of coordinating activity. What do I mean by that? I'll give you a brief example by analogy. Some of you may have seen this before. It's a roundabout in the Netherlands. Can you spot anything unusual about it? It's not completely, but it's mostly devoid of markings and signs. So you notice that there's not actually a separate pavement. There's a small groove there separating the cars from the bicycles from the people. This is the brainchild of Hans Monderman, who was a Dutch road traffic engineer about 10 years ago, 15 years ago. He had the bright idea that in order to make roads safer, you should make them more dangerous. What a great idea. So what he meant by that is we've created road systems which are so clogged up with road signs and markings and stuff in our way that we kind of check our brains and we spend so much time looking at the markings rather than looking at other cars or pedestrians that we actually make more mistakes than if those markings weren't there. So his idea was strip away all this stuff, create what he calls an open space in which the pedestrians and the cyclists and the cars can coexist. And they figure out for themselves the best way through that. And of course, as you can imagine, what happened when you first come to a roundabout where there's no signs, you slow down and you figure out what everyone else is doing, and you figure out a way of getting through that thing, to your destination without hitting anybody. And sure enough, the predictions will prove true. Within a few months, traffic speeds through there were kind of back to normal, and there were no fatalities. And this is now a model which they're trying out in a number of other jurisdictions. That's true. We tried it in places in the US and places in London and so forth. It's not the panacea. Let me be very clear on that. Monderman doesn't think that road markers should be completely removed. On a highway, he says, that's the space for cars. You need very clear rules. But in a space like this, where it's all about the coexistence of cyclists and people and cars, this is a better way. Now, you see where I'm going with this. What's the sort of the motto for management? The motto is a simple one, which is that if we leave employees to figure out for themselves what to do, rather than working through a set of formal management processes, 99 times out of 100 or more, they will do the right thing. They will figure out for themselves what the best way of working is. They don't need a manager and all the road signs, which are kind of the visual manifestation of management, to tell them what to do. Less is more. It's the same point in a slightly different way. So a lot of creative work can be done around how you create what you might call emergent design in organisations. Just a brief example from UBS Wealth Management. This is their private bank. A few years back, they realised that the biggest orthodoxy, the biggest challenge to growth was their budgeting process. We've all got budgeting processes. We all know how budgeting works. Budgeting is a ritual that takes many months of the year, and ultimately, if I'm the sales guy and my boss, sits at a distant head office, he proposes one number, I propose another number, we end up at a compromise, which doesn't really suit anybody. They said, this process not only takes a lot of time, it's also kind of minimalist approach. So let's get rid of it. Let us replace it with an alternative mechanism whereby people are free to invest as much or little money from the central pot as they wish in their business, and they'll be evaluated against their peers at the end of this period of time, and the bonus will be purely based on how we're doing, rather than our performance against the budget, our performance against our peers. Now that might sound pretty obvious, but in the process of doing it, they managed to kick out an entire management process that everyone agreed was not really adding a whole lot of value. And what you see, of course, is it's got into trouble now for that next 3 or 4 years. The elimination of their budgeting process was a mechanism for freeing up and growing the organisation. A couple more brief examples. Another aspect of emergence is getting rid of some of our resource allocation mechanisms. And Eden McCallum is a boutique strategy consultancy in the UK that doesn't have its own consultants. It's a bit like Top Code in that respect. And what they do is when they find a client, they work with the client to identify within their network suitable consultants who they can work with. And the client essentially picks the consultants themselves. So a traditional consultancy spends a lot of time trying to match up their body of consultants with the work that's available. Very often you get the trainee consultant who doesn't actually know what they're doing. This model makes the clients much happier because, of course, they get to actually choose the people. And it means Eden McCallum itself can be incredibly lean. It's only 20 people actually work for Eden McCallum. Now, it also relies on the fact that not all consultants are going to earn 100% of their salary out of this company. That's fine. They know that going in. And they have kind of a core team who get a lot of work, and then we have a peripheral team who get smaller amounts of work. And then finally, the famous expenses scandal. I mean, we can all draw our own conclusions from this. I don't know how big it was in Ireland, but certainly, you couldn't pick up a newspaper in the UK for the last month without seeing this on the front pages. This was the most egregious one, I think, the Duck Island of St. Peter Villiers. point here is dead obvious, which is that they had a mechanism for expense claiming which didn't work because, first of all, it was bureaucratic, and secondly, it was very, very secretive. And it ultimately created all of these completely inappropriate behaviours which are coming back to haunt our MPs. There is a very simple alternative, and it works in the police force today. It works it's gradually being phased in, which is, the MP or the police chief puts his expense claim online, and most people don't care. But the fact that he has to put it online means that somebody can check it if they want to, which means that he then is sensible about it. And the idea that we would use peer pressure, meaning in this case peer pressure from the media, but you can easily imagine how this works in an organisation whereby we don't have extravagant rules about expense claims. We simply have an online system. You put the expenses, and if people don't like what you're spending money on, they'll tell you. And in fact, I was doing a little bit of work with Roche, the pharmaceutical company, and they're putting in place an experiment right now on exactly this process. Let's take our expenses system, let's create a peer pressure-based mechanism. So it's a small case, but the point is, it's an alternative to bureaucracy. That's the point I'm trying to make. And then finally, hierarchy. Hierarchy in some ways is a subset of bureaucracy. Hierarchy means I have legitimate authority over you. I am both more knowledgeable and, shall we say, I have more responsibility than you, and I can kind of tell you what to do. That's the concept of hierarchy. There is an alternative concept. It's sometimes called wisdom of crowd, and sometimes called collective wisdom. And you see it most personally in Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, where the guy who can't answer the question has got a couple of options. He can phone a friend and he can ask the audience. Well, guess which turns out, on average, to be the more effective strategy. It turns out. Now, the smart ones amongst you will say, well, hang on, these are the difficult questions. That's fair enough. They are. But the bottom line is that we've got an audience who were not chosen for their great intelligence. I mean, this is people who've got nothing better to do. Tuesday afternoon, roll into ITV recording studios and say, the game show, right? And somehow, between them, they get 91% of the questions right. So there's something about the kind of fragments of knowledge which are held across a group that can be aggregated together and collectively create a better or more sort of correct answer than one expert. And there are many examples of this. I mean, if you think about the stock market works on this basis, if I told you the price of Microsoft shares was dreamt up by 3 people in a little planning team, you wouldn't buy those shares. You'd trust the share price because thousands of people have all pitched in with their own views as to whether it's over or under. So lots of ways of applying this. Let me just give you a couple of brief examples. Lloyd's Bank in London. I was talking to this chap who runs their innovation practice, and he says, we need to figure out a way of getting people to kind of mobilize their effort around their new projects. So this isn't just an idea scheme that they've created. This is a scheme for actually implementing ideas. And what he said we need to do is to create essentially a prediction market, an internal stock market, on which you're betting on the likelihood that this set of ideas, this set of 20 ideas, will actually reach fruition. And they created a trading scheme. They created an artificial currency. They call it the bank beans. And everyone has an allotment of bank beans. And they can do day trading or whatever. They're allowed to do insider trading. And originally insider trading, meaning I can bet on a project that I'm personally involved in trying to make come to fruition. And the issue is that all insider trading is bad. But then they actually realise that in fact insider trading is exactly what they wanted. What they're trying to do is to get people to weigh in with their own effort to get certain projects moved towards fruition and to essentially get some sort of credit for it. Because ultimately, if they've got a lot of bank beans, they can cash those in for certain prizes. So it's a mechanism for kind of bringing together thousands of people to have a point of view on the kind of currency, the potential of certain projects. And if I just give you one more example, I mentioned this briefly yesterday, which was some friends of mine at Roche who decided that they wanted to experiment on how to get solutions to problems that they had. Because this concept of urban innovation says there are thousands of people out there with bright ideas and knowledge that can be accessed. And they did an internal process here whereby they've got 2,446 R&D staff. They gave them a series of technical problems and said, can you help me with these? And then they went out to Innovating, which is this external provider, with 167,000 people in their network in order to try to see if they can get some useful ideas about how to solve this kind of problems. And indeed, as I mentioned yesterday, it turned out this external marketplace, Innovating, was of an order of magnitude more effective at giving them useful solutions. The internal one wasn't a waste of time. They got one really useful idea out of it. The external one was dramatically better. So the wisdom of the crowds is about pulling together the fragments of knowledge held by people around the world. And of course, the point is it's fundamentally different from a hierarchical view. The hierarchical view says, trust me, I'm an expert. Believe me, because I've been around before. Collective wisdom says, actually, yes, your point of view matters, but in fact there are thousands of people or hundreds of people, all of whom have got little fragments of information which, if you collected it together effectively, would be very useful for solving the problem that you're facing. And again, there are situations where hierarchy is better, and there are situations where collective wisdom is better. So let me wrap it up. I did a survey just a few months back to ask companies where they felt they were on the spectrum. And the yellow line there is kind of where they felt they were today. And the red dots are where they felt they would be 5 years from now. Now, I'll be the first to admit this is kind of wishful thinking. This is people saying the words on the right kind of look more alluring somehow. So I don't have any sort of credence in the numbers here. What I use it to do is to make a very simple point, which is that while we think we all want to head over towards the right, the truth is actually more prosaic. To go back to my original point, I don't believe that management, 5 years from now, will look exactly like it does today. Neither do I think it will look completely different. There are gurus out there, my friend Gary Hammer amongst them, who are predicting a complete radical invention of the world of management. The truth lies somewhere in between. The truth is that we know what the dimensions are, and good management is about making conscious choices about where we want to be on each of these dimensions. So there's no one best way of managing, neither should there be. The best way of managing is the way of managing that suits your organisation or your department at this moment in time, depending on the particular stage of growth it's at or whatever. I've focused on the principles, the high-level principles. The principles in turn, shall we say, beget processes which beget practices. So that the way that you actually, manage your 360-degree feedback, to give you one example that we used earlier, that is a management practice which is inspired by a point of view about your management principles. So I think my basic message is you need to be clear what principles you're basing your management on. And rather than just assuming that we'll always do it the way we did before, I'm saying there are some choices to be made here. And the smart company, at very least, is conscious of the choices that they made, the principles that they based themselves on, and ideally, they use it as a mechanism for enhancing their distinctiveness. A cleverly thought-out management model, as used, for example, by Top Coder, can be the basis of competitive advantage. With that, I will stop. Thank you very much. So, shall we...
Principles of management.
Yeah.
One of the core principles in leading a team is trust.
Yes.
And the integrity of management roles.
Yeah.
What's just that to some extent?
So, is trust important? Yes. Is trust a core principle? Yes. Does it find its way specifically into my framing? No, it doesn't. It's a good question. I mean, I think I'm probably operating at a level of abstraction that doesn't include trust, neither does it dispute trust. What's the opposite of trust? Because I think it's important that we define these principles in a way that one can see that there's kind of a choice to be made. The trouble with trust is that the opposite of trust is mistrust. And no one would intentionally build their management system on mistrust. I mean, I think a lot of companies end up doing it by mistake.
There's a lot of roles in organizations, take a high technology startup.
Yeah.
An R&D person have a very clear view on their role.
Yes.
And what they're bringing to the party. Whereas a manager or a leader has got a myriad of decisions to make, and the quality of that decision making is pivotal to how the success of the company will drive forward. So the technical people, the specific functional roles have to have trust in the management and leadership to make successful interventions.
So look, I mean, I completely buy that, and let's not have a false argument. What I'm struggling slightly with, and this is a question, I must ponder it on the fly home as everyone, is how can you frame that in a way that makes it more than simply an axiom, if you see what I mean? Because trust is almost by definition something which is a desirable quality in an organisation. And often, a lot of the things I'm talking about here potentially either breed trust or damage trust. Lehman and so forth are good cases of companies where the trust has got damaged. What I'm just going to have to ponder as I think about it is what we can do with this concept, because it's too important a concept to completely ignore. I think that's probably what you're saying, isn't it?
Well, I think there's an awful lot of talk about leadership at the moment, and trusting leaders. And that doesn't mean you get everything 100% right with that. There's an openness there. And also, the role of manager is quality rather than quantity. Okay,
that's very helpful. So in some ways, can we define different forms of leadership and characteristics of leadership, such as integrity or whatever, that might then breed trust to a greater or lesser degree? I think it would be useful to say to ourselves, what are those dimensions of leadership which are really effective in building trust, and which ones actually getting greater trust?
So I was just, I thought that is an interesting question, but I had thought that you had abstracted it into alignment, because in big organizations, my experience is in selling in ideas and projects, you always come across various islands of prejudice. It's like a pinball table, trying to get things to light up and trying to stay in play. And so you come across conflicting agendas, and I have felt that the trust issue featured in alignment, as far as because I don't know whether the opposite of trust in organizations, I would suggest, is either a different agenda or some level of suspicion rather than.
Okay, that's very helpful. We did a survey, I haven't got the results of it here, but we did a survey of about 1,000 managers across the world on the biggest single sort of concerns that they had, as it were. And we gave them 25 categories. And the number one challenge was reduce fear and increase trust. The single one number, there's loads of other stuff about depoliticizing decision making, making organizations better. Reduce fear and increase trust. So, I mean, it speaks to both of your point, which is that there are many organizations where fear is endemic. And it might be, very visible fear in terms of fear of upsetting my boss, but there's also the fear of not doing as good a job as you might. You lay out the elements of fear, and a lot of the sort of if you like, the problem, the design flaw, modern organizations, one of the biggest design flaws is that there is too much fear out there. And of course, as you say, the flip side of fear is trust. So I think for me, I can do a better job of figuring out how to blend this across, because for me, it's almost a kind of a pervasive theme for everything I'm trying to do here, is to say, what's the problem we're trying to solve? We're trying to make organizations more trusting and less fear.
One of the interesting slides you showed related to India and Japan, the level of engagement and disengagement. I thought it was quite profound, particularly in Japan. And I'm just wondering how much cultural norms impact the management innovative and maybe limits the innovative capability. We see a lot of major Japanese companies now in the sea and Panasonic. Difficulty.
It's a really good point. I mean, I've toured large parts of the world, as it were, looking for management innovations and looking for models of management that are either better or worse. And interestingly, what you find, as you say, in Japan and in China, you see almost no experimentation. And there's something about the cultures there that breeds a level of conformity and a level of kind of follow the leader in terms of how they work that is really quite striking. And while they are bringing up the tail, as it were, quite quickly in terms of getting rid of the bad practices, there's no one kind of pushing the boundaries. Whereas if I go to India, and I was in India just recently, you see both incredibly dynamic, innovative companies. A lot of interesting management practices emerging from India, it turns out. I mentioned HCL, I've also studied Tata and Infosys, for example. In India, you've got the full spectrum from incredibly innovative to incredibly poorly managed, if you see what I mean. The distribution within India is like that. In China, it's more bunched. And then if you go just within Europe, Scandinavia, for whatever reason, lots of innovative stuff. Some of them as innovative companies are Swedish and Danish and Finnish. Whereas if we go to continental Europe and France and Germany, again, we see much less. So I think it is to do with cultural norms. And I've sort of made the observation that we see significant variation in levels of innovativeness and management, country to country. But I haven't bottomed out exactly why. Interesting point, yeah.
On one of your first slides, you had General Motors, and you had Lehman, and you had Enron, but you also had Société Générale.
Yes.
What I'm interested to, you were talking about failures.
Yes.
Enron is quite clear, but what was your view on Société Générale?
Well, you know, some of you will remember Jérôme Kerviel was the rogue trader who, caused them to lose $3.6 billion or whatever the number was. I mean, I put it there purely for that reason, because this is a company which was, as far as I can understand, reasonably well. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, you get the rogue trader who brings the bank to its knees. And you will all remember Nick Leeson from Bearings fame, 10, 15 years back. So we are visibly a failure of management when the rogue trader kind of hits. And yet, I know enough about these systems to know that if a committed rogue trader really wants to break the system, he can. And some of them are very sophisticated, and some of them are, in fact, incredibly amateur. And the amateur ones should be and could be stopped, but the sophisticated ones cannot. So this, again, gets us straight back to trust, which is you will never design a system, a formal system, that completely kind of cuts out the possibility of someone trying to defraud that system. And therefore, it has to then fall back on the softer sides of risk management. I mean, I have this very simplistic argument that there are three ways of managing risks. You can, which has formalised risk management systems through the systems and procedures. You can essentially externalise the problem by asking the credit rating agencies to tell you, what sort of things you should be investing in, and ask the regulators to take a look. Necessary but not sufficient. Or you can personalise risk management, meaning making sure that the individuals who are making these decisions, the traders, actually feel some level of personal accountability for what they're doing. And clearly that's a bit sort of missing. Yeah.
Would we be right in assuming that there's a strong correlation between management of process, innovation, and
yes.
product?
Correct. So if you can imagine a kind of a value chain sort of picture of an organisation, think of the kind of the primary value-adding activities. We bring products in, so we bring goods in, we transform them, send them out. Those, in my words, are the business processes, right? And a lot of the business process re-engineering was about making those work efficiently. On top of those are what I would call the management processes. And this is processes around new product development, processes around capital budgeting, resource allocation, leadership. These are value-adding, but only indirectly value-adding. So, to your question, process innovation is typically viewed at the level of the business processes. Management innovation is almost the sort of the analogous process, but at the level of the kind of the management work that supports the primary value-adding stuff. So,
3M has often been quoted as an example of a highly innovative company in terms of products.
Sure.
How does their model in terms of management?
Yeah.
Process?
So the way I would describe it, yes, 3M you can look at the products that come out and say, wow, this is really impressive. Inevitably, then, you have to say, well, what drives that?